Lovely. Okay, so hello everyone. Welcome to another episode of Chatter. Today I am delighted to be joined by Alex Varley Winter, 10-year investigative journalist, ambassador for Transparency Task Force, and former writer for the Byline Times. Alex, welcome to the show.
Hi, great to be here.
Well, yeah, it's great to have you. So I first came across some of your work while there was a lot of people criticizing Keir Starmer for some of his policies made in the first few months and suggestions that he might have been influenced by big donors. And I saw some things you'd retweeted, etc. And then here you are. So to start with, when you tell us like a little bit about Transparency Task Force and who they are, so people can get like an understanding of like what you do and where your expertise is.
Yes, well, I joined TTF around the pandemic Transparency Task Force. They're basically a group of former finance people and also combined with victims of financial crime and some whistleblowers, people who work as expert witnesses as well in cases challenging banks. They're a really interesting group of people spanning a lot of different interests. They originally were set up in response to the pension freedoms legislation, which was intended to give people more power over how they use their pension money, but in reality opened up a lot of people to being horribly scammed. And so they started out trying to raise awareness of that, and then all their interests just completely scattergrammed because there is so much actually going on in the financial services sector that's poorly regulated. And it really just comes down to victims of crime not being listened to, even if they've got a lot of paperwork, a lot of paper trail to show what happened, to show who might be involved. They generally see a pattern where the same people that screwed them over are able to do it again and again, or are just not being pursued with enough vigor by the justice system. And that just seems to be a systemic problem. And that appealed to me because I'd seen it happen before. Off my own bat, I'd investigated things in the courts. And I think the first time the scales fell from my eyes was when it was during the war in Libya. I was looking at my editor at the time and asked me to look at what was happening to Libyan assets in London. And randomly, I'd seen a case come up in the High Court that said it was against the Libyan Foreign Investment Company. So I just went along to the hearing to see what was happening. And it turned out to be a conman who was pretending that he'd bought a debt off, say, Gaddafi for, I think it was a few billion, and that he was pursuing this from various people. He was caught and he did go to jail, I think for 15 years. But what shocked me was how far he'd been able to get before being caught, given that he'd completely made this case up. He'd got like a sock puppet company to supposedly represent the other side. And anyone that had taken even a sort of short skate through the paperwork could have figured out that this wasn't really the Libyan Foreign Investment Company on the other side, and it was actually him pretending to be them. But still, he'd managed to get a court order stamped by a judge initially to say that he was owed this money. And I was just shocked that could happen at the highest court in the land, that there wasn't more protection against fraud. And you see that across a lot of the system. There's a lot more vulnerability than people realise. So another case that I haven't been able to report on because the person is in danger if I do, was where a chap had his house stolen from him using fraud. He was close to retirement. He'd nearly paid off the mortgage. And the chap just posed as him, went to a solicitor, pretended, and managed to get the whole house transferred to him. The guy approached the police. They said, "Oh, it seems like he's probably done this before." Oh, yeah, he probably has if he's this skilled at it, But did they pursue him? No. The guy's son was getting death threats if he pursued it. And so I just feel like, there's nobody often we've got too much of kind of policing by PR or policing on social media, or just having an appearance of doing something, not only by the police but by financial regulators as well. And they're often on the side of the people making the money, but that's not protecting people. And if you want, also it taps into the growth agenda that the government are talking about, is that if you want a thriving economy, people have to feel safe enough to do business. If you've got fear holding the economy back because they don't feel that they're protected if something goes wrong, or if they're targeted by fraud, then you don't have, people won't necessarily want to invest their money if they don't know that it's safe, and that's, most of the time you can probably assume that it will be, but if there is financial crime going on, it needs to be tackled robustly.
Yeah.
And it's not like there aren't a lot of watchdogs, because there are, but a lot of them have conflicting briefs where they're tasked with doing one thing on the one hand, and then they also have to do another thing, and so they end up at loggerheads internally.
Yeah, I think that happens a lot more than people would realize, in terms of different competing regulatory agencies and quangos, like all trying to stake out that it's like, oh no, this is our bit, or this is our bit, or this is our bit, and it's like it's literally like that meme, like the police are handling a case and then the FBI come in. It's like, oh well, we'll take it from here. That they want to take over, like people want to have their own jurisdiction over different things, and instead of like all working in lockstep together at the goal of reducing crime, fraud, things like the cases you've described happening, they end up just sort of worrying about their own sort of little territorial battles within the regulatory space. And I think what you said about regulatory capture as well is really something that people that listen to this show will have a lot to say about, in terms of it is the people who have the ear of the government, and quite often then the regulators themselves, that are able to have their cases looked into and be sort of seen in a more favorable light by the regulator, or given the benefit of the doubt in many cases. I wanted to ask you just briefly about this Libyan case. That sounds fascinating. So the guy had bought a debt,
He said he had.
He claimed he had bought a debt from Gaddafi.
From Gaddafi's son.
Oh, from Gaddafi's son. Okay, and then he got a court in London to affirm that had happened. Like, what was he providing as evidence for that?
They just did it all on paper. So he put in his claim, and he posed as the other side by creating a shell company like he used one of those temporary offices that is like not a real office, and pretended that they had an office, and was like, and saying, we represent the Libyan Foreign Investment Company, we admit this debt. That's all he did. And he got an order stamped by the judge, and was going around town trying to claim this debt from any bank that held any Libyan money. And it was just, I think he must have been a bit unwell, perhaps, to think that he could do that. But, it's like just the fact that it had got to the point where it got to, where it was actually being heard in court, and the bank was employing lawyers at a huge sum of money to defend themselves against. And he even went into court pretending to be somebody else. He was in court pretending that his name was Kenroy Brown, and his actual name was Gail Childs. And just, it was just such a shonky system, and I was shocked. It was actually the first time I'd gone into the High Court as a journalist. I'd gone into magistrates' courts and things like that before, but I was thinking, this is the High Court. The Chancery Division should be more protected, really, from that sort of nonsense.
Yeah, you'd like to think so, wouldn't you? You really would like to think so. That's wild too. Like, someone needs to make a film about this. This sounds hilarious. Like, a guy pretended to be someone else in court. How much was the debt?
Oh, I wish I could remember. It was more than 200. It was an insane amount of money. I think it's more than 200 billion.
Wow.
I remember. Yeah.
That is a lot of money. Like, that is a lot of money.
Yeah, it wasn't 200 million, it was 200 billion. It was,
200 billion, like pounds.
yes, he was. I think he was completely mad.
Yeah,
To be
because if you're gonna try and do that, like make it for like 200 grand.
honest.
You know,
Exactly.
get like make it an amount you could find believable and get away with it.
That's why I thought he must have been completely off his rocker, but maybe that's why they didn't suspect, because, why would you make up something so audacious? But yeah.
Yeah, and I think like the fact that we in the UK were like contemplating dealing with the assets sold by an African dictator. I don't know enough about Gaddafi. I hear like rumors that he wasn't as bad as people say, but I don't know who to believe on him. But like, yeah, definitely autocrat, shall we say? And we're in London debating like and processing that through our courts. It's because London is, I think it's the Oliver Bullock said we're butler to the world, right? For the world's dictators and financial criminals. Essentially, we provide the place where they can do business. Um, do you think that we're going to see that change? It like under so we've talked about the budget, and there's been talk about cracking down on some tax evasion, on some non-dom stuff, but like there hasn't really been like a huge signal that there'd be big crackdowns on financial regulation. Like, do you see anything changing in the coming years under the new administration?
I mean, have to hope that it changes. Because I try not to be too cynical. I feel like if you do present people with the evidence, things might change. Have to be hopeful about it. I mean, TTF's approach is kind of that they want to connect, say, victims of financial crime with people who can actually make a difference, and they tend to be cross-party about how they do that. They make sure they approach people from all parties, and just to put it across, because otherwise people get very isolated who have actually been at the sharp end of some of this stuff. But certainly, I mean, in London with like housing and things like that, if you don't start to grapple with financial crime, then you won't free up a lot of housing stock that's being abused as just a place to park money. I feel like it's a side of the housing system that's not really being considered, and needs to be looked at more seriously.
Is that something you've looked at a lot, like the storing money in housing assets in London? Like, it's something that if you go about walk about London with anyone who's lived here for 5 years or more, in their area, they'll be like, oh, well, yeah, no, that's empty. That's just Chinese property speculators, and like that's empty. Oh, that's a bunch of like Arab oil billionaires. They bought up a bunch of apartments in there. They're not doing anything with that, and it frustrates me no end, because we're here in a city screaming for more housing, and the supply far outstrips the demand. It means we pay like obscene prices for rent, and yet we have all these buildings sitting empty, being used as financial assets.
It's true. It's really wrong, and I feel like that is the big thing that would change things for this government, actually, is if they could show people that they can reduce their cost of living day to day. I mean, a huge chunk of it just goes in rent. And if you can't rent in London, sure, maybe you can live somewhere else, but then the jobs won't be there. So then you have the cost of commuting. So I mean, I feel like they ignore it quite a bit. I was slightly disappointed in the budget to see that they are allowing rent increases by social landlords above inflation. So it's like there's no kind of attempt to, there's no real attempt to reduce people like social renting or their costs of living, which could have been done, I think, quite easily. But I don't actually cover that sector enough to know for sure what they're grappling with there. I just think it could be a lot better. As a Londoner, I just think it could be a lot better.
Yeah. Well, that means you watch the money come out of your you come out of your account every month. You become more and more anarchist every month. It's like it took me. Well, I used to joke about people in uni called me like a diehard communist, and I used to joke that it took me 3 paychecks to become a libertarian. What was your thoughts on the budget generally? Have you had a chance to look or think about any of the stuff?
I haven't had a chance to look at it in detail, but I just think that in general there needs to be more open-mindedness about how the system works as a whole. Economists, people who specialize in economics, are much better to look at than me on this. But I read Professor Steve Keen, for example, and Anne Pettifor and Richard Murphy, and they all present evidence to say that the way that the state looks at debt is wrong and is actually disproved by the evidence. How the system works in classical economics is not how it works on paper. Banks and governments are creators of money. They aren't just managing other people's money. And Pettifor is being consulted on a biopic of John Maynard Keynes at the moment. I don't know if it's going to be a blockbuster or like a niche indie film, but I think that kind of thing needs to be looked at more because his story and history is quite important, and he took the view that the economy should serve people. People should not serve the economy. It needs to be the economic system needs to be brought into service of people. And although, I mean, in some ways the budget is making some progress in sort of pursuing slightly more wealthy sectors of society for tax, for example, or not being quite as generous. At the same time, it's kind of just tinkering with the deck chairs instead of looking at how the system actually works. Because the whole mindset of austerity just seemed to be built on the wrong foundations. I just think that people like Steve Keen need to be given a lot more time and from people in power, because him and Dan Pettifor and Richard Murphy do seem to know what they're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, I had Steve on the show a couple of months ago. It was a fantastic guy to speak to, and I think finance is one of those weird things where like it is so difficult for people to grasp a lot of the concepts because if you say to people we shouldn't be in debt, it's bad. We shouldn't run a deficit. That's bad because if you think about, you shouldn't be in debt as an individual or as a household or as a consumer. You don't want to be having piles of credit card debt or like, okay, well, mortgage is an acceptable form of debt, but like the idea that the government's finance works the same as an individual or a household is just insanely stupid. I mean, obviously, people don't grasp it because no one gets taught that. It was years after leaving school, after having studied like politics, maths, then in uni, same thing. I did law and politics, and obviously, it's not exactly the same. But you'd think at some point along the way, someone would explain to you that the government doesn't work the same with their money as like a household, and especially in this country where we have the ability to print our own currency. Like we're not tied to like the European Central Bank where we'd have to discuss monetary policy with a bunch of other nations and institutions. Like we don't have to go to any. We literally just go to the Bank of England and be like, give us the money.
Yeah.
And instead we use banks as debt creators, and we use banks to pump all the money into the system, and then therefore everyone's paying debt on the banks, and we're paying interest on our own debt to ourselves instead of just issuing the currency. It's a wild thing. It seems so stupid when you explain to people that like it's the British government's money that they issue with our consent, and we could just print more of it without going into debt, but we choose to have a system set up where we just take the debt. It blows my mind.
There's a TTF member in Canada, I forget his name, but he's written a book called Farming Humans. He was a banker, and he basically says it's like that. It's extractive. It's extracting money from the client rather than doing anything else.
Yeah.
It's kind of an extractive system. Other writers have looked at that as well. I think a lot of the changes came in around the noughties in finance, where it just became a more extractive system, where it's kind of getting as much out of the customer as you could get away with. And if they're going to, that's why a lot of people have moved towards fintech and towards other systems of finance, is because of that declining trust in the banking system.
Is it Larry Elford?
Yeah.
Farming Humans, Easy Money. This looks really interesting. 2020. Wealth of Nations meets Animal Farm. A blend of Adam Smith and George Orwell to explain how we arrived at today's economy and society. Oh, wow. I'm really going to have to look at this. Is he still alive? Hopefully.
I think so.
Okay. Harry Elford. Has he written anything else? Apparently not. One book, one of one. Non-fiction financial murder. That's what it's listed as. That's amazing. I'll have to look at that. That's like really interesting. But yeah, that's basically like a lot of people sort of use that analogy that it's the financial system like sucking money out of the real economy and sort of like taking an ever larger
and how much
portion.
of it stays in our economy as well, because it's such a massive huge offshore system. How much of it is this just like capital flight? I don't know, but
yeah. I mean, it confuses me. It also I'm wary of saying, oh, that's the reason. Like, okay, so are you familiar with Mark E. Thomas, the 99% organization?
Yeah.
I love his work, and he sort of points at like since the 80s we've been in this like neoliberal system where like the financial system has grown, and so is the size of the top 1%, and the amount of wealth that they control compared to the rest of us, basically, and that we need to try and find a way to get back to what it was like in the 60s and 70s. And like, obviously things weren't perfect, but if we had like the 70s, there was a lot of years where people point out and be like, oh, it was awful. And he's like, well, we had 5% growth. Like, what are you looking at that's awful? And basically, he thinks that there's just an ever-increasing amount of money being sucked in by the financial system, and that plays into stuff from Nicholas Shaxson as well, the finance curse, and I'm like, oh, so that's why we've all been getting poorer for 40 years. And my only reservation about it is that too simple an answer? Like, because I'm always really wary of things that like seem too easy to be true. Do you know what I mean?
I mean, in some respects, life used to be more expensive, but that's because of advancements in science. It's not really because of changes to the economics. You know, life is in some ways more easy and convenient than it used to be, but that's because of streamlining of industry and that kind of thing. The actual financial system does seem, I mean, my view might be skewed by having had access to a lot of victims of crime. You know, you hear the worst cases, but to me it seems to have become more extractive, whereas banking in the late 20th century seemed to be more rooted in a service that rather than a, you know, neoliberal system.
Yeah. So like, yeah, the people were customers of the bank, not like a product to be packaged, chopped up, and then sold, and then put all together again, and then chopped up, and then sold, and it's derivative. Yeah. It's concerning. Like, do you think that there's like an argument to be said? Because like every single time someone mentions like raising tax on the wealthy, like I'm always of the opinion like we should just try and close the loopholes, that like we don't need to raise taxes at all, that if we just maybe closed some of the ability for people to store money offshore and send things through offshore entities, take out some of the profit that they want, and then send it back into the UK for use. And I've always felt like if we could try and close some of the loopholes that are in there, we wouldn't need to like do the big headline, corporation tax has gone up or capital gains tax has gone up. You could just be like, all we're going to do is collect what people owe. I always felt like that was a better way to go about raising tax revenue. But the argument in both cases that I've heard is always, okay, go ahead, they'll all leave. Like I've heard stories in the last week or two about solicitors firms who can't hire people fast enough, right, in order to help companies move out of Britain for tax purposes. Obviously, that could just be rumors that you see on Twitter and LinkedIn and stuff, but it speaks to something that people are always scared of, right? They think that if you make the conditions any more onerous at all, we'll get what you said, like you said, a capital flight. They'll all just like up and go. Like, do you think that's a real concern? Is this something we should like really worry about when we're trying to like think about maybe how do you regulate or tax the financial system anymore?
I think that the industry should worry more about trust. I think that their whole basis of making money, I mean, I don't necessarily know if it's about tax or about integrity. It's like, I feel like if your customers don't trust you, you're not going to succeed as an industry. I feel like if you're going to build it on sand, then you're not going to grow anyway. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation, I think. I haven't really formed a firm opinion on tax and where it should go.
Well, then maybe.
I think it shouldn't go to the bottom.
Yeah.
I think there should be more at the top. There should be a lot more at the top. But how the mechanics is done, I'm not sure.
Well, maybe think about that question then more in terms of like regulation, because people are always talking about, okay, we need to regulate the financial sector more stringently, and the same arguments made, like, oh well, if you make business difficult for them to do it, they'll all do it somewhere else, that we'll lose our title as butler of the world, we'll not be the place where all the worst people ever come to store their money. It's, do you think that argument has any merit, that like we shouldn't regulate because that will like scare the business away?
It was interesting because at the moment we're so light touch. I mean, I went and covered For Mouse in the Court, which is an excellent little blog on financial services court cases. I went to cover the collateral fraud trial. Was it last year or the year before? Last year. And that involved a lot of evidence about they were convicted. It was a fraudulent place where people were parking their money to grow it. They'd basically got the license on false pretenses, or they portrayed that they had a license when they hadn't. But the people's money was being put in there, and the company was making money, and the FCA was giving evidence in that court case. But it was clear that they'd had access to the system, they'd seen inside the system, they'd seen the false marketing for ages. And because the company was making money, they were quite reluctant to go in. And the only reason they went in the end is because they realized that the company had pretended that it was basically, these guys had a license for pawnbroking, and they were able to just go in the system and edit it to the name of a different company. So that was the basis on which they were pursued in the end. But when you looked at the fine detail of what they were claiming in their marketing to consumers, it was misleading, and they could have been gone after much earlier. But because it was making money, it seemed the regulator was reluctant to go in and shut it down, because they knew the backlash that would come from the industry or from some consumers who would have been making money on their investments there. So yeah, it was a tricky one. But yeah, they did shut it down, and the guys were prosecuted. But it was like the system was so shonky that they could just go in and change the name without any questions asked. It took ages for the regulator to even notice that they'd edited their own name to something that they weren't. So
That's wild.
Yeah.
I think it speaks to like everyone thinks that the government is so bloated and overfunded basically, and then you look at the financial regulator or HMRC, and they're like screaming for more money to go after people who are skirting the rules in ways exactly like this. And why do you think there is it just more that you don't want to spook the markets, like you don't want to put more money into like making sure the law is applied?
Yeah, it's true. I mean, I feel like there needs to be a bit more, they call it like security by design, that there needs to be less. I mean, maybe they can use AI to help with that, actually, in terms of trying to make design systems so that they can't be abused in the first place, and then you prevent a lot of frauds taking place. because they would not have got a license in time to do what they wanted to do. But it was basically money secured on small items, jewelry.
Yeah.
That's what they were doing. But that is pawnbroking, basically. But they were pretending to be something else.
So to change direction just a little bit on what we've been talking about, the one of the things that I'd seen you've written a lot about in the past, or at least some about, was farming. We've talked about farming humans, now maybe about farming farms. So you wrote a piece quite a while ago. It was about soil and about what you'd learned about the soil quality and erosion basically in Britain. Like, so how worried do we need to be? Are we on like the verge of ecological collapse?
I think that effectively what I learned through that piece was that there's not enough being done on keeping the quality of the soils good. George Monbiot's written quite a lot more about this in his book Regenesis. I think I did that piece before that book was written, but since then I've read it, and it covers a lot of this in detail, how the soil actually works, and it has a lot more bearing on greenhouse gases than a lot of us realize. The emissions from farming are not really being accounted for when people are designing policies on net zero, like aside from the idea that, oh, peat is good, that kind of thing. There's not really much accounting being done of how farms work, especially in crop farming. But what it basically learned from that piece is that when farmers plough the land, unless they manage their fertilizer system extremely well, they risk releasing nitrous oxide at that point. And most people talk about carbon dioxide when it comes to global warming, but nitrous oxide is 200 times more potent as a greenhouse gas. So it is actually quite important to get it right. So basically, there were innovators looking at how to help farms that want to stop ploughing. And the main way would be by having robots, little mini robots, so clearing weeds and doing those tasks that mean that they can have a no-plough farm and manage it a lot more effectively without having to resort to chemicals as much. Because additionally, if you use weed killer and things like that, that can also increase the amount of nitrogen in the soil as well. And too much nitrogen in the soil, if you then plough it, can turn into nitrous oxide. So it's just a whole side of science that I'd not really looked at before. And it was really interesting to see how people were innovating there. But then subsequently through reading, it got me interested in Monbiot's book about it as well. And he has a whole section on animal farming. And, I'm not vegan and never have been vegan, but, he presents a really compelling, like, statistical argument that, the meat consumption that people are on at the moment is much, much too high. There have to be alternative sources of protein basically developed that will help people to reduce their footprint. Otherwise, the amount of hunger for meat cannot be remotely met. The hunger for cheap meat, really, cannot remotely be met in a way that actually reduces emissions or stops the climate changing massively. So yeah, it's a really good book to check out. Whether you like him or dislike him, it's very well argued and well sourced on just looking at the science and how it works.
Yeah. Like I said before we started, George Monbiot and I agree on a lot of the problems and disagree on the solutions. I think but the cost of food, I think, is one of the things that is really under discussed. I've had a couple of people on the show talking about how much farmers get screwed by supermarkets, and there's some studies that show at times they're getting 1% of the value of the food they put in the supermarket. And it's wait, what? 1%. So say a piece of chicken, a kilogram of chicken costs £12. They're getting £1.20, or sorry, no, they're getting 12p from that, which is insane. What's 12p for a kilogram of chicken? That's you're probably getting chicken breast, you get like this like maybe four chickens worth in there of like chicken breast meat, and you're paying 12p. Like, it's well, they're getting paid 12p for it. It's wild, and it's one of the things that I've never quite understood is why governments don't see the importance of food and like the importance of food security. Like, if you go back to the 70s, 80s, our food production was at like 95% of it was made in the United Kingdom. And it is to make the food here is the most environmentally friendly, because shipping anything in from overseas just like skyrockets the ecological footprint of it. So if we're trying to achieve net zero, we should be trying to make all our food here, because say, like, bringing in, say, if it's, I don't know, something to replace some other form of protein, like nuts grown in North Africa, to bring them here is far more like ecologically costly than to have a cow from 1 mile away. You know, it's like this weird trade off, I think, in things, and farmers get really screwed. Like, but the budget showed, like, again, they haven't really given like any sort of help to farmers. There's been, you know, the talk about the inheritance tax thing. I need to look at like what that is. But like, why do you think like farming as a thing in general is like kind of ignored as like a major issue that we face as a country?
I mean, there's a lot of subsidies, and a lot of farmers just survive on subsidies. They're not really surviving on what they're doing. I mean, well, arguments can be cut different ways on the science of farming and how to make it sustainable. I mean, Monbiot's position is more on, you know, the amount of land that it takes up to do it properly is not going to be viable, because. So, I mean, either way, I think there needs to be a lot more research done into low cost protein and how to make that in a way that doesn't use up like vast tracts of land. I don't think that livestock farming should disappear, but I think that it does need to be. We can't have these massive factory farms that are horrible for the animals anyway, and also, I mean, in terms of factory chicken farms, we can't have that in terms of they pollute the water system, they release a lot of nitrogen, which is going to release a lot of nitrous oxide. It's not really possible to do that, but perhaps there would be ways of sort of balancing some livestock farming with some other means of protein production, basically. But there needs to be a lot more innovation in that space. But yeah, I do think that farmers are often kind of ignored as compared to landowners, and I sometimes think there's a blurring of the lines between the farmers and actual farmers and landowners. Most farmers I know that actually farm livestock on the ground are just kind of, they just live subsistence basically, and they are very dependent on support.
Yeah, it's disappointing that that's the case. Yeah, just because I don't know, I feel increasingly like we're in a very volatile world, and we should be trying to reduce our reliance on external sources of really key things just for our own security as we go forward. It's like, because I don't want to be reliant, or our farms, for example, to be reliant on potash nitrogen fertilizer that's like a third of the world's supply is made in Ukraine. So like that's got the price of that skyrocketed because of the war in Ukraine. And this is just one of these shocks to prices and like systems. You can't predict that that's going to happen. Like 3 years out, you can be like, oh, well, you could, you know, there's the people who always knew, oh, I've been saying this for years, you know, Russia, we're going to do something. It's like, yeah, but you can say that about it, and people are warning about every kind of apocalypse ever, and then if one person's right, it doesn't mean that they predicted it accurately. But like there's always shocks to these systems, and I feel like we should be trying to figure out ways to not be reliant on, yeah, very key things to our economy, like in a large source from somewhere outside of the United Kingdom. I also feel like, you know, we left the European Union, unfortunately, or fortunately, depending on where you stand on it. But the idea, at least, was that, okay, we should try to be slightly less reliant on trade to completely run our economy and our local economy more specifically. But
Yeah. there's something like there are 7 pinch points around the world for global trade, like the Straits of Gibraltar, the Suez Canal. These things, if even one of them is knocked out, it has a vast impact on the global food system. And we've seen that with Ukraine as well, with that being the breadbasket of so much of Europe. It's, and parts of Africa as well, is that it has a massive impact. And war as well has a massive impact. I don't even know why people are doing that anymore. The costs are enormous. The disruption is enormous. And
well, I could give you some very speculative answers, but it involved military industrial corporations spending lots of money on lobbying, and then the same financial institutions that have a lot of stake in said bomb manufacturers then coming in very kindly to finance the rebuild of the places that are being bombed. It's a lovely system for them. So that brings us quite nicely to something that we wanted to talk about, which is the Israel-Palestine conflict, and more specifically, the UK government's attitude towards Israel. Because I sympathize with a lot of people who look at the Palestinian situation and say, okay, well, Hamas are a terrorist group, etc. They took their hostages, and yes, they did all those things. They're a terrorist group. They've killed people in cold blood.
They wanted it at The Hague.
Yeah,
the ones that are still alive.
Yeah, yeah. But they haven't had an election since I think it's 2003. So it's not like the Palestinian people are the ones being like, yeah, boys, go on, go for it. I mean, they will probably be more and more radicalized towards that position as people continue, as Israel continues to firebomb people to death. But it seems quite clear to me that, like, regardless of your thoughts on Hamas or Hezbollah, that the Israelis are just committing war crimes, and there's very little in terms of like arguments that I've seen that shows me that it's not like an attempted genocide at the minute, like telling people to move to one section and then bombing it, like killing UN peacekeepers who are attempting to or UN aid workers. I can't remember if it was peacekeepers or aid workers, but just
I was reading a heart-rending account by a doctor who's just been killed by a quadcopter in a hospital. He was basically moving from hospital to hospital to hospital, and he'd been writing like chapters on his experiences, and it was just in a Google document that had been sent to journalists. There's a HuffPost article about him and a link to what he'd been writing. He was killed a couple of days ago just by a quadcopter in a hospital, and this is just insanity. It's just depraved, and I don't understand how they ever got to that point, but it's just insane. It's I understand the kind of radicalization that occurs when innocent hostages have been taken, when people have been gunned down at a music festival, but Palestinian civilians are not responsible for all of that, and you can't say that they are, any more than you can say that all Israeli civilians are responsible for what the IDF is doing.
Yeah. You said civilians, that's the anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
Which it would be. Yeah.
It would be. And so equally, you get Islamophobia is seems to be entrenched going the other way. And I just don't understand why there's not more of a rules-based order being imposed for the sake of like global kind of safety. I mean, the same thing is happening in Ukraine. Putin's been bombing hospitals and ambulances and targeting civilian infrastructure. It's but they've been labelled a mafia state for a very long time. Yeah,
we sanctioned the fuck out of their economy. I mean, unsuccessfully, but like we did it. do you know what we put? Like the government went, "This is wrong. This is where we draw the line. This is bad. You can't just invade." Fair enough. And then they put a bunch of like economic sanctions on them. It's like, okay, you whether or not it was successful, it's a different question. But like you've at least upheld what you claim to be your belief system, and you've said, okay, here's where we draw the line. You don't get to have trade with the West now that you've done this. Although some fuel still seems to get through, but still, like there's still massive consequences for them having done that. And yet the Israelis seem to be doing more egregious attacking. I mean, it's difficult to tell exactly what's going on in either war because the propaganda on every single direction is horrendous, and it's so hard to tell what's like really happening on the ground. But it seems quite clear that there's quite aggressive bombing of Gaza, and just children being killed in hundreds and thousands. It's like, when did we think that was okay? Like, well, why do they find it so hard to condemn those actions, do you think?
I mean, I don't know why it bewilders me, because it's like, you can say, oh, we are very dependent on America for protection. We're dependent on NATO. America's position kind of determines our position. We don't know really what's going to happen after the election on the 5th. I don't know whether things will change after that, but it just seems way too late. I mean, and there doesn't seem to have been a substantial change between the previous administration under the Tories and now under Labour. It's they seem really wary. I know some people would say, oh, it's just, it just comes down to donors. There were people who were supportive of Israel who backed Starmer's campaign early on. I don't know whether that explains it, or whether it was a fear of alienating Republicans in America that led Labour to take the stance that it has, or Starmer himself personally.
No, they were very fine with like 100 Labour activists going to help come out the Kamala Harris campaign. I don't think they're scared of offending Republicans.
Yeah. I guess so. I mean, I don't know. I think it partly comes down to personality and guts, and whether anyone actually has it. It's like, it might also come down to fear, because there's been an awful lot of meddling in British politics by far right, whether that's Israeli far right or Russian far right, or, different far right groups. Those affiliated to, well, I don't know if Viktor Orban he originally started as not being far right, but has become increasingly regressive in that way.
Yeah, I mean, people talk a lot about his social policies, but the way he's like destroying the country internally is way worse. Like a Hungarian friend who like laid out exactly how him and his cronies are just carving up the entire country for themselves. Like, that seems to be the horrifying bit that nobody talks about.
But his kind of method of saying, being like, painting anything that's just kind of critical as being somehow woke, or anything that's anything that might be a new idea that people that he feels people might be, is suddenly labeled like woke. That's kind of an Orban playbook.
I mean, that's probably how he's getting away with a lot of stuff, because he labels the criticisms as woke, and then people are like, oh, well, he's just doing what he wants, but he's fighting the woke people, so good. Not destroying the entire country internally. Like,
and there's nothing wrong with the word woke. It's the way it's been spun. It's like everything's just turned into spin instead of people looking at what's actually happening. I mean, when the war on Gaza originally started, I was worried that a lot of the content online might just be propaganda by Iran proxies, or that kind of thing. I was wary of being taken in, so I went to an event at the Frontline Club where it was medics speaking, and these people had trained medics on the ground in Gaza, so they definitely knew the source they were speaking to. They were people they'd worked with directly, and they began to spread their alarm when people were being just abducted. People they'd worked with, trained, knew that they were just medics. They weren't terrorists. They were people trying to heal the sick, and knowing that they had just disappeared, being abducted by Israel. And it was like, that was what had sparked their alarm. And so it was after going to one of those talks by medics that it was like, it gave me confidence that at least what they were reporting was definitely something that they checked out, that it was coming from people they knew, and that it wasn't just kind of some story or some scare story.
Yeah, I mean, that video that came out a few weeks ago, that person on an IV drip like burning to death, that just was one of the most harrowing things. Like there's been some awful images from that war, but that one in particular was just awful. It's like, how can you not feel sympathy for those people and be like, why is that happening? Like even right, even in the depths of like World War II, right, fighting the Nazis, when Britain firebombed Dresden and people were just getting straight up killed, like when the images started to be released of that to like the British public, like they were horrified. And like Churchill was like, is this really what's happened to us? Like, you know, I can't remember what the exact quote is and whether it was specifically about Dresden, but shown like images of some of the firebombings of German cities. He's like, are we beasts? Like, is this what we've become? And like even then fighting like the worst people that you like, the worst regime, like the evilest thing that people can conceive of, were horrified at killing innocent civilians. And yet we get less outrage from our government, or at least seemingly from people who are meant to advocate for peace. And like the Labour Party, people like David Lammy like puts himself or pitches himself as this, you know, warrior for the downtrodden and the forgotten and the people of minority background that, you know, don't get a fair like crack of the whip in modern day Britain. And yet we're fine with this. You know, it's such a weird
I'm sure he would say he's not fine with it, but then they're not showing enough transparency yet on what on earth they're doing about it then, because I mean we've supposedly reduced arms sales by 10% of like, and it's like but when you try and get that disclosed of like what exactly is it that we're not providing anymore, because we basically provide parts for parts of what America provides Israel. So it's, I mean, America is the leader in it, but we're kind of like one of their sidekicks providing parts and things like that. So yeah, it's basically like when you actually ask, what is it that we've stopped providing? Is it going to make any tangible difference on the ground? The answer is probably no, unless there's a reason to be persuaded otherwise. And it just seems so limp. It's just not. It's not enough. It's not even. I mean, even one of these civilian casualties would be devastating, and you've got 40,000. You know, it's just obscene.
Yeah,
It's
40,000. That's the official reported number. I assume the number is probably higher than that. Having witnessed some of the devastation, as long as the videos that I've seen are real. Anyway, we have fast blasted towards an hour, and I know you have things to do and children to look after, etc. So I would want to thank you for coming on the show. Really, really interesting chat. Some stuff I have to go and look up, especially that human farming or farming humans. That's definitely going to go on my reading list. Is there anything you want to plug just before we finish?
No, I don't think so. Check out Transparency Task Force, but that's about it.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Hey, listeners, real quick. Do you ever find yourself sitting watching the stock market like this? Well, now you could instead be ordering my book like this. It's the story of GameStop. You can purchase it with a hoodie, with acknowledgements, or just with the early backers edition. It's all about the GameStop story. It's the real story, not just what you've seen on films. It's exactly what has happened over the last 3.5 years. And with DFE back, I'm finally able to draw a conclusion to my book. Please pre-order it. It really helps me out, and you will get it eventually, I promise. Hopefully this year.